going to show you the two types of terrariums and how to plant them. So there are many different versions of terrariums, and I'm sure you've seen many of them. They're very popular. You find posts of really creative ideas on Instagram. But basically, when you narrow it down, there are two different types. There are the closed terrarium and the open terrarium. So you might be asking yourself, well, what terrarium is right for me? And that is a good question. You want to decide whether you fall in love with a particular object, the terrarium itself, or if you fall in love with a particular plant type, as very specific plants are going to thrive best in these two different types of terrariums. So if you're looking for a closed terrarium environment, you want to select plants that like high humidity, because the closed enclosure is going to trap the humidity in there and keep a nice moist environment. So tropicals work really well for that. And for me, I selected ones that are going to enjoy low light as well, because I plan on keeping these inside. That way I won't have to worry so much about augmenting with artificial light. I can place it near a window, or I can simply place it near my other plants that have lighting setups already. If you are a fan of succulents like me, then you're going to want to stick with an open terrarium, as this is going to allow the excess humidity to evaporate and thus not causing issues for your succulents or cactus. So once you've got that figured out, which terrarium style you want and what plants you are attracted to, then it's time to go ahead and start layering your soil. And this is really important with terrariums, as they are a closed system, meaning that there's no drainage in the bottom of your vessel. So you want to create those different layers that is going to help sustain and create a microenvironment for your plants to thrive. So to show you those different layers, I'm going to start with the open terrarium, because I've chosen a glass vessel for that, and that way you can see all the different layers. Now, some of these layers are very important and you need to have them regardless of what terrarium setup you choose. Others are optional, and I'll make sure to let you know which is which. The very first layer is the drainage layer, and this is going to be the very bottom layer. Because we don't have any drainage holes built into our containers, this is a really super important layer. Perhaps one of the most important layers in the construction of your terrarium. If you do not have a well-built drainage layer, then you are likely to cause a molding and rotting situation, which is going to kill your plants and destroy the look of your terrarium. So what do you use to put in the drainage layer? Well, basically you need a pebble, a rock, some sort of small hard item that is going to create little pockets for the water to sit. And you want to keep this separate from your other layers, so that way it holds the moisture in that little basin that you create, allowing it to come up if needed, but keeping it separate when it's not. So the options you have are basically up to your imagination. You can use small stones, you can use glass beads such as these, you can use marbles, and you can use hydroponic clay balls, which is what I'm going to choose for this particular terrarium, because I want my aesthetic, since I can see all the different layers, to go with what I'm intending with my succulent selection. So I've gone ahead and rinsed and soaked my clay growing media, so that way I don't have excess dust or any other elements that I don't want in my vessel, because this is going to be a visual aesthetic as well as a protective layer. Also, when these aren't saturated, they float. So sometimes that may cause a disturbance, but because we're having other layers placed on top, that shouldn't be an issue. So ideally, I want 1 to 2 inches of a drainage layer. I went on the moderate spectrum of the depth of my drainage layer because I have such a small vessel, but you can bump up that drainage layer if you're using a larger vessel, or if you know your plants are really susceptible to moisture, because then you want to make sure you have a better established drainage layer. The next layer is the moss layer, and this is an optional layer, but I really like it, particularly in these glass ones, because it's going to create that strata that's really appealing to the eye. And it also creates a boundary between your drainage layer and the other layers on top. That way, your soil, your other elements aren't going to filter through and get into your drainage layer, kind of defeating the point of the drainage layer in the first place. Now, moss is super absorbent, so it is going to allow the transfer of the moisture upward to the soil and downward for drainage. So it's not going to cause a problem, but because of its fine texture, it's going to create that barrier and work really well in this process. For the moss layer, I'm using a store-bought sphagnum moss, and it comes in these like hairy sheet-like things. So I'm just going to try to place it down and make a nice horizontal layer. And to aid with that, I'm gonna get my trusty squirt bottle out. So you can see it's just kind of sticking up all over the place. And so I'm gonna now wet that thoroughly with my squirt bottle so that way I can make sure that I have good coverage of this layer. Then I'm just gonna gently compact that down and press it down with my fingers and the back of my fingers. So I want it to be just kind of a flat layer. All right, in doing that, I see I have a little void over here where I can see my underlayer, so I'm gonna add a little bit more moss. All right, that looks pretty good to me, so we're ready for our next layer. The next layer is the charcoal layer. This is another optional layer, but you may find it really beneficial for your terrarium building. The reason why is that this is really gonna help with odor control. So if you have these set up in your house, you probably want to make sure that you keep odors to a minimum. It's also going to help remove any toxins that may be in the water that you're using, if you're using tap water, or that may be inherent in the soil or excess mineral buildup, whatever. So it's going to keep a nice equilibrium in your little miniature environment. So you can purchase horticultural charcoal, or you can simply go to your nearest pet store and what they call granular activated carbon, which is just a fancy name for charcoal. If you're going to add this to an aquarium, you were probably going to want to pre-rinse this. So you could do that in this instance as well. I am not. I'm just going to wing it. But I am going to get a spoon to try to help create a nice thin, even layer. I don't want to go crazy with my charcoal layer. And again, I'm using the back of my spoon to compact that layer so that I have nice coverage and a nice strata that will be pleasant in the appearance of the terrarium. And there you go. If you don't want to dedicate a full layer to simply just charcoal, you can mix a small amount of charcoal into your soil and it'll still create that odor repelling or absorbing effect that is desirable in a terrarium. The next layer is the soil layer, and this is when you're going to come back and think about what terrarium you're creating. So again, this is the open terrarium and we're using succulents, so we want a soil that is suited for succulents. So I got a pre-made mix for succulents, and that's what I'm going to use for my soil layer. A good way to judge how deep your soil layer should be is to assess your plants. Now these are in little tiny cups, so I know I want my soil layer to be at least that deep, probably a little bit more so. So I'm probably going to go clear up to there. You can get fancy with your soil layer if you wish and do different levels. Like if you're not using a pre-mixed, but you want to have a mixture of sand, soil, and say peat moss, for example. You can kind of layer that so that you see the stratas in your vessel, but it's just completely up to you. All right, so I didn't fill it quite as full as I intended to, and that was on purpose because I still have to put my plants in there. So another optional layer, which I briefly discussed, is a decorative soil layer. And that's if you didn't use a premixed and you wanted to have different layers of the soil to be shown as strata in your vessel. But I'm not doing that, I'm just using the mix, and I'm gonna go straight ahead to the next obvious important layer, and that's the plant layer. Because if you don't have plants in your terrarium, then what are you doing? So these are the plants that I've selected for this particular terrarium. I wanted to have a variety of different colors. I wanted to have a variety of different textures and different heights. Ideally, you want to keep these small. I'm going to have some peeking out, like this guy is going to be sticking out a little bit. This one might too. That's one of the fun things about succulents. Succulents are really easy to propagate, to create new baby succulents. So when these guys get too big for this container, I can simply remove them and repropagate them and create a whole new setup. So I'm just going to take my spoon and create little wells and start planting my plants. A helpful trick about replanting plants is if you avoid watering them the day before you know you're going to repot them, they come out of their packages so much easier and they are ready, eager, and willing to get that new fresh drink of water once they're established, which may aid in root growth. Simply invert, give your pot a little squeeze, and that'll help loosen the compacted dirt and roots that are in there, and then gently wiggle, and the whole thing should come out like that. All right, now that I have my plants placed in there, it's obvious to me I need some more soil, so I'm gonna go ahead and fill it up so that I'm at the same soil level as the plants were originally in their smaller pots. There are some kits that you can get for creating terrariums, or they're similar to the tools you may find if you have a bonsai kit, where that have brushes and little spades and rakes. This may help you get in there and arrange your soil in your different layers better if your fingers can't reach, because when you get into the really small terrariums, like these guys, your hand's probably not going to fit in there quite as well, so it'll be helpful to have a tool. You can also use inexpensive small paintbrushes. Those work really well. I'm also, again, the squirt bottle. I love the squirt bottle. But this way I can rinse off my leaves that have collected some of the soil and help compact that soil layer down so that it's level, and also give everybody a drink. Okay, the final layer is your decorative layer, and this is another optional layer, but for this particular setup, I think I want to have some nice desert colored pebbles to be on the top layer. That's going to give a nice contrast between my plants and that very top layer. So for that, I'm using these little tiny rubber rocks. With these open glass bowl style terrariums, it's really important to make sure that each layer goes all the way edge to edge, because you're going to see that on the outside. So now that this terrarium is complete, I need to do a bit of cleanup, and then we'll see what it looks like. And there is our completed open style terrarium. So let's go ahead and move on to the closed style. So the closed style terrarium that I have has a removable lid that is glass and a solid footed base. So because my base is solid, I don't have to worry so much about the visual aspect of the strata of layers, as they won't be visible. But I do need to make sure that I have a well-constructed base so that way I can have a healthy terrarium. So for this particular setup, I'm going to focus on the drainage layer, the moss layer, the soil layer, the plant layer, and finally get a little fun with the decorative layer. For my drainage layer, I am choosing the clay pebbles once again, simply because I feel that their pH neutral balanced and their moisture absorbability make them a really good option for a drainage layer. Next, I'm going to add just a little bit of sphagnum moss just to create that little barrier between my drainage layer and my soil layer. I am going to dampen that down just to keep it compact. I'm not really worried about the look because you won't be able to see it. Alternatively, you can soak the sphagnum moss ahead of time, but you want to be careful that it doesn't get too matted and clumped together, or it may become more difficult for you to spread out. Because this is going to be planted with tropical plants rather than succulents and cactus, I need to choose a different soil type. So here is my soil selection for these particular plants. And I'm just gonna go ahead and put in some of this, and I'm also going to add some of the charcoal and just mix that right into the soil. That's going to still have the benefits of the charcoal without having to have a separate layer. All right, so now I need to think about my plant placement within this container. I want to make sure the tall plants, based on how this is arranged, are more towards the center because that's where the peak of my top is, where the sprawling plants can go along the edge. Also, because my planter here isn't very deep, I'm going to break up this root ball just a little bit to try to get it to lay slightly flatter. You want to be really delicate with this because you don't want to damage the plant. And in hindsight, I probably would have only selected these little tiny pots because then I wouldn't have to worry about the depth as much. To make sure that I have it planted deep enough, I'm going to go ahead and temporarily place my lid on to make sure that there's room for the plant. And there is! Awesome! And now I'm just going to simply plant the rest of my plants. This trailing plant, I want to make sure that I encourage it to grow within the parameters, otherwise it's going to get crushed if I remove and replace the lid. Now that our plants are placed, it's time to add more soil where needed. Okay, so to create plenty of growing area for these particular plants that I've selected for this particular planter, I kind of created a dome for the soil, so that way it slopes upward towards the middle, giving it more growth space for these plants. I made sure to use my fingers to push the soil clear of where my lid is going to rest, and now I'm going to give that a good water. All right, so my finishing touch is going to be my decorative elements. And for this, I went a little bit on the fun side. It is fall here right now at filming time. And so, you know, because this is kind of a old style terrarium, it made me think of, well, I went goth with it, let's be honest. And I found these super cute mini tombstones. And so that's what I plan to add to this particular terrarium. I also have some white glass marbles. They're not actually marbles. They're the kind of little glass things that you get to put in vases for flowers and whatnot. And so I'm going to try to make a little path-like looking thing. I really don't have a lot of space for a path, but I don't know. It's kind of fun. All right, I need to make sure that this sprawling plant is tucked in there neatly so I don't smush any of it. If you have a piece that's just being really stubborn, you can always trim that off. I think we're good. All right, so this section here is kind of protruding, so I'm going to put my lid down on that side and use that to help push everything in place. So as long as you have a good understanding of the different layers of terrarium building and what they are used for, you can get as fun and creative as you like. Make something really interesting and appealing that shows off your own particular personality. Terrariums also make great gifts, so keep that in mind for the upcoming holiday season. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.